Thank you very much for that kind introduction. My name was the only part I understood, apart from too many acronyms of our company. I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to speak at this occasion for very selfish reasons, perhaps. This is the first occasion. This is the occasion where the first translation of my book into a foreign language takes place. I would like to start my talk by thanking CANactions and thanking Saga Development for making that possible. It makes me extremely happy. Shotiri Shtini Tadach. Well, Four Walls and a Roof in English. Is a book, meanwhile, about 18 months old. A book I wrote primarily, I guess, to hammer away at what I see as the misplaced confidence of architects, of my colleagues, and admittedly perhaps also my own. Very briefly, the book is divided in 7 parts, each of which tries to debunk a myth which, in my view, looms over the profession of architecture. The myth of authority, the myth of individual inspiration, the myth of good causes, the myth of professionalism, the myth of independence, the myth of mastery over the large scale, and that of progress. While in and of themselves, these are of course very laudable aspirations, it is meanwhile clear, at least in my view, that it takes a very, very little change in context for those aspirations to become something very different and something potentially damaging. The number 7 is not entirely coincidental, because just as the 7 virtues of the Bible, it only takes very little, and they're intimately linked to their 7 sins. I think the fate that modern architecture has been bestowed in the 21st century is indicative of that shift. This is a social housing estate in Marzahn, in the former East Germany. At one point, a communist country that embarked on a massive, massive housing program. This is part of the largest social housing estate ever built, entirely made up out of prefabricated concrete, out of a very, very, I guess, early form of extremely industrialized building, in a way the dream of the Bauhaus finding its ultimate moment, the moment where architects, in a way, had stopped being necessary. The interesting thing about a prefabricated building is that you can build or assemble it very, very fast, but you can also demolish it very, very fast. In a way, its demolition is playing the film of its construction, but backwards. Which strangely means that if you demolish the building, you end up with the same panels or the same spare parts that went into the building. And it is in the life of those parts that an interesting sequel to that architecture lies. This is one of the panels, adapted, recycled, and reused in a very different type of architecture. That is, of course, the cover of the book. The interesting thing, this is a traditional house. This is a house that if you plaster a sepia filter over it, is a house not of the 21st, but rather of the 19th century. Nevertheless, it has all the ingredients of the era before. It has modern architecture, it has communism, it has industrialized building, it has everything. It just looks so damn traditional. This is but one instant. This is but one instant where modern architecture slowly but surely is becoming undone. This is a Corbusier villa in Besnus, close to Versailles in Paris, one of his earlier villas. And today, that roughly looks like this. It's sort of like Versailles has caught up with the modern villa built there. There are many examples. We all know what happened to the Palast der Republik in former East Germany. The site currently of the rebuilding of the Schloss, or actually a new building. The main purpose of the new building is to replicate what was there before. Not the next chapter of history, but a repetition of a previous chapter of history. The list goes on. Marktplatz in Hildesheim, converted very heavily as of 1986 to look like this, and essentially again to resemble that which had been there since the 16th century. It happens all over the place. This is the National Theatre in Macedonia, part of the former Yugoslavia, quite a successful breeding ground of some pretty interesting modern architecture. This is the Macedonian National Theatre as it was recently constructed, again to resemble the National Theatre that had been there before. This is the administrative court, part of a wave of modern architecture present in Skopje in the 1970s. That underwent a refurbishment. Well, I guess refurbishment is a bit of a euphemism in this case. In a sense, it's got reclad from the outside. Then this is partly finished, and that is the whole thing completely finished. So that something that looked like this ended up being like that. It's completely a new building. It's a metamorphose, which I guess undoes very successfully every modern aspect of the building. A government building from the 1970s, part of the same wave, also got a makeover, looks like this, some sort of unsuccessful version of the White House. And this is the main protagonist of that architecture, Mr. Nikola Gruevski, Prime Minister of Macedonia until 2016, a fervent lover of architecture. I can guess, you can guess of what sort. And somebody supposedly currently on the run and who had to leave the country dressed like a woman. Don't know why. Skopje is an interesting example. Skopje had a modern master plan made for it by Kenzo Tange in the 1960s, which was meant to be executed, a rather radical metabolist plan, a part that got executed in parts, but hardly with the architecture that probably he had in mind. So this is part of that plan. This is part of that plan. And this is another extremely recent building in Macedonia, the Port of Macedonia, the Gate of Macedonia, would you believe it or not. If this type of regression, if this type of return to the past were limited to architecture, there would probably be very little reason to worry. Architecture, I am convinced, in and of itself is not important. However, more often than not, architecture is a seismograph, an indication of something much deeper and much more fundamental. If one continues to compare, in a way, this is 1968, this is another arch, not the Macedonian one, the student revolts in Paris, heralding a kind of new era. This is the rather more Philistine equivalent we experience today. Again, the 20th century, the first awareness of the finite nature of the Earth's resources. I guess one could call the Club of Rome the beginning of sustainability. This is a somewhat prevailing view today, that all the attempts at converting climate change make only this bit of a difference. In the 20th century, late 20th century, Britain wanted to join the political experiment that one could call Europe. Today, Britain leaves. This is the face of a revolutionary in the 20th century. This is the face of a conservative revolutionary in the Netherlands at this age. And there's an eerie similarity in the partial refusal of the beard to reach properly manly dimensions. A list goes on. Willy Brandt, Chancellor in Germany, the likely successor of Angela Merkel. I think the image speaks for itself. The family, as it was seen in the 1970s in a somewhat more experimental sociological state, the family as we have it today. The last slide is interesting. It is part of the Hungarian family protection plan, whereby the Prime Minister tries to counter the shrinking population of Hungary by upping the birth rate of people and at the same time resisting all forms of immigration in Hungary, which is a weird contradiction in terms. So that is the first new Iron Curtain we see going up in Europe nearly 30 years after the last Iron Curtain was successfully demolished, 8 November 1989, the great celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburger Gate, which I guess one could sort of see as the beginning of the end of the 20th century in a way. There have been many speculations about the Berlin Wall and what it meant and what was expected for the period afterwards. Probably most bravely speculated on and articulated by Francis Fukuyama in his book, The End of History. Point of the book, to put it very briefly, he said, had the world, until 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, had it consisted of competing ideologies fighting for hegemony, a capitalist, a communist, and a non-aligned bloc, after 1991, it'll only be a matter of time before the world collectively embraces democracy. The world will become democratic, and as a result of democratic, it will become prosperous. Prosperity and democracy were supposed to be intimately linked. More about that later. 30 years later, we see a rather different world. I'm very happy that Ukraine is blue in this map. In short, we again see a world divided into three parts. The blue part is electoral democracy. That is the part that Fukuyama thought would be universal. There you have elections. The red part is non-democracy. There you don't have elections. And then the yellow part is a very interesting part that is gaining ground, that are countries where you have elections, but you know the outcome in advance. Russia, Turkey, etc., etc., etc. Now, it was Fukuyama's premise that if you embraced liberal democracy, you would be economically successful. But if we take a measurement today, and we look at the amount of money at the disposal of governments themselves, a rather daunting picture emerges. Oil, again, plays an enormous role, whether a country is democratic or not. Norway is the only democratic country in the top 5, and if you add it all up, electoral democracy sort of comes out at the bottom of this. And I think that's where the real problem lies, is that much of the architectural regression presented in the beginning is but a symptom of a rather more worrying economic trend, which is probably so far best articulated in the book Capital in the 21st Century, the first earnest research into the inequalities that arise when the capitalist system is uncontested, by Thomas Piketty, French economist, research he has conducted at MIT, and even though it's a very, very big book, its premise is very simple. He compares two economic categories, two ways of making money. Money you make from working, and money you make from having money. And once you make more money from having money, somebody who works can work all he wants, but he never catch up with those who already have the money. Now, the interesting thing is that for somebody like myself, who was born somewhere in the late 20th century, the whole notion that one ought to make more money from working than from having money is kind of normal. You would presume that that is the standard condition. Nevertheless, Piketty's research over the course of history shows something very interesting. Where are we? This is the curve that indicates money made from money. And this is the curve since the beginning of times that indicates money made from work. And curiously, only during a very, very brief period did mankind actually make more money from working than it did from possessions. Incidentally, that is also the time of the great utopian movements. That is the time of modernism in architecture. That is the time of big social housing projects. Once you, in a way, put the modern manifestos in the same timeline, you get a very interesting thing. When the revenues from labor are on the up, social emancipation happens, and at the same time the utopian visions emerge. 1972, the year of Pruitt-Igoe, the demolition of a big social housing project in St. Louis, which is generally seen as the end of the believability of modern architecture, the end of Siam, the end of Hilbersheimer, etc., sent shockwaves to the profession. That's 1972. And after, architects' writings tend to take a rather different character. They become more reflective, they become more pensive, but writing nevertheless continues, and it fills up essentially the bar. Now, if you zoom out, you see that a period of modern idealism in architecture is just as exceptional as, in a way, labor overtaking capital, that there is an eerie synchronicity between the heydays of modern architecture and the heydays of a kind of a fairer economic system running roughly from 1914 to 1989, if you analyze the Graaf. Strangely, starting at the time the First World War started, ending at the time of the Berlin Wall. The most important architectural manifesto of 1914 was the Futurist Manifesto in Le Figaro by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. The most important, or at least most sold book about architecture of 1989 is A Vision of Britain by Prince Charles, a member of the British aristocracy. And Prince Charles is still going strong. He presents very generous awards to conservative architecture almost on a daily basis, the Driehaus Architecture Prize. And the vision of Prince Charles is by now the prevailing view of a respected democracy as the United Kingdom. There is the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which is an official government body. And the task of that body is basically to ensure the quality of the built environment, which in short means fewer of those buildings, more of those. At which point, I'm sure that at some point London will look a lot like Skopje if things continue. But if this is the case, if this is the inevitable path of architecture, and everything else, then one could say that one is at a point that that brief interlude of Piketty perhaps never took place. And perhaps this is the normal course of history, where that is always the case. And that might, in many ways, seem a very hysterical exaggeration, a form of hyperbole. Nevertheless, if you take stock of what has happened since 1972 and started with the Pruitt-Igoe demolition, there have been many more. There's Lyon, there's Sheffield, Chicago, Dublin, Naples, Paris. I can do this for a very long time. Lyon, Nantes, London again, Glasgow, Lyon, again Paris, near Paris, Glasgow, Frankfurt, and Trellick Tower. This is a social housing project in London that has not been demolished. I guess one of the few. But something else happened to it. Something else happened to it. It is in a very favorable site in the city. It was privatized and the rental apartments were put on the market for sale. Relatively small apartments were being sold off on the market at interesting prices. The price of a one-bedroom flat was about £333,000. The average income in the UK is £32,000. The maximum mortgage you can get on the basis of that income is £150,000, so not even half of what the apartment costs, which is interesting that I guess a former social housing project has a second lease of life where it is no longer a social housing project. Yes, the building is retained. Yes, the architecture is retained, but it may have well been demolished because either way it's no longer social housing. So social housing either gets demolished or it becomes unaffordable, and in both cases it's no longer social housing. Modern architecture tends to serve rather different purposes today. Modern architecture is involved in a breathtaking race that in a way gives shape to escalating real estate prices. A recent building in Amsterdam, modern architecture, I guess, a record sale of 16.2 million for the most expensive penthouse. In the Netherlands, that is an extortionate price for a home, but it is nothing compared to what happens in other parts of the world. Factor director Bennett Lebeau, a penthouse alongside Central Park for 45 million. London, another part of London. Nick Candy, the property tycoon, buys a penthouse for £160 million. And that is something he bought from himself. Essentially, one of his companies sold it to another company for a ridiculous amount of money so that a precedent would be set that that is what these things cost. Because when one is sold for one, you cannot sell the other one for cheaper. That goes on. This was the record before Candy broke it. Michael Dell, the boss of Dell Technologies, £100 million penthouse in the Park Avenue Tower of Vignoli. Now that is an interesting building. It's an interesting piece of modern architecture. It's an interesting piece of engineering. It is a building which I guess would give the architect many, many reasons to feel very, very proud. But there's something funny. The residents seem to have agreed amongst each other that only every 14 floors people switch on the light. So either the residents of New York have become extremely sustainability conscious, or there is something else happening here. And what is happening, it becomes clear once you go up. The spaces that are lit are not apartments, but essentially plant rooms recessed from the facades, which are lit to suggest inhabitations, because the 14 stories between those plant rooms are largely empty. But that doesn't matter. They are sold, and they are also sold for an enormous amount of money. This is again 60 million for a 3-bedroom condominium, not a very big thing. Looks like this. like a furniture showroom. It doesn't really look very lived in. Another one, a bigger apartment for 87 million to a Saudi retail magnate. Looks like this again. Highly publicized sale. Jennifer Lopez and Alex Rodriguez bought their love nest for $15 million. But the love nest doesn't look like a lot of love is going on in there. I mean, the bed doesn't really look slept in. So essentially, the purpose of that tower is for people to buy apartments and then sell them for more money than they bought them. In other words, the whole apartment tower is exactly Piketty's theory of property accruing more value than labor. Apartments are purely speculative investments. And then, of course, the tall tower with one apartment per floor is an ideal typology. Because if your neighbors are absent, you don't notice it because you don't have neighbors. So in that sense, one could suspect that the typology, rather than a kind of strange engineering feat, might be strangely functional, given the fact that the tower has no function, and they become thinner and ever more extravagant. But they're not lived in, and they get thinner. And one wonders, thinner? But if they're not lived in, they can become even thinner and thinner, to the point that the whole of Manhattan, one could say, exists entirely of concrete sculptures that serve as piggy banks for international capital flows. It's not just Manhattan. Most of the downtowns, most of the modern downtown skylines that we know harbor an enormous vacancy. 20% in Perth, 15% in Adelaide, more than 10% in Toronto. 1/3 of Vancouver's real estate market is owned by Chinese buyers who don't live there. 10% of the houses for sale in Vienna are also mostly bought by foreign investors. And there's something funny about this list of cities, because this list of cities are invariably cities that rank very, very high as the most livable cities in the world. Vienna, the most livable cities in the world. But the most livable cities in the world, strangely, are also the cities with the most vacant real estate. So in other words, cities are livable when you don't live there. There's a strange correlation between livability and absence. And cities that have huge amount of vacancies, they are invariably into placemaking. And placemaking is a word in my practice, I hear it increasingly often, very often. I don't know what it means. I have the lingering feeling that a lot of people who use the word also don't know what it means. But if nobody knows what it means, of course nobody admits, so the word gets used ever more often. So we went in search of a definition, and we found one. Placemaking is an innate ability that we all have. So this is placemaking, somewhat naive, obese, debilitating activities of fun happening against the background of presumably empty buildings, little dog houses with people in them, again against the background where the people are here, they're not there. Vancouver, another thing, and Toronto. Games, fun, childish activities, again against the background of buildings you wonder. So that is strange. The most livable cities are invariably rich cities. They're cities with some of the highest net average income of people, but they're also expensive cities. And very often they are more expensive cities than that they are rich cities, in the sense that prices rise further than income rise there. So we made an interesting comparison. This is the top 10 livable cities, average net salaries, average price per square meter of a home in those cities. Then let's look at the definition of what constitutes an affordable home. An affordable home is a home that costs 2.5 times what you annually earn. That is also generally what the bank is prepared to lend you. So 2.5 times, these salaries constitutes the price of a home. So then you can do some interesting arithmetic. 2.5 times the average salary divided by the average price of square meter gives you the amount of square meters in each city that you can buy on a reasonable income. So the more livable the city, the smaller the house you can buy, to the point that in the number 1 of last year, Vienna, a normal person can buy something of 15 square meters, 3 by 5. That is a Corbusier guy on his side in there. So the affordable home is slightly bigger than a maximum security prison cell, slightly bigger than a Jayco caravan, slightly larger than a regular car park space. Interestingly, it is smaller than what the early experiments, the early Bauhaus and communist experiments constituted of what was supposedly the minimal home. We have traded down from the existence minimum to the container. And the container is unwaveringly popular in constructing new buildings in our cities. But the point being is there has been a strange trading down since the Bauhaus. This is a very unfair slide because this is an exhibition item about the Bauhaus to be displayed in the Bauhaus. So it's not a home, but I mean it's an interesting, the kind of Russian doll effect is interesting, that apparently by abandoning progressive ideals, abandoning left-wing ideals, we have traded down. We thought Fukuyama's promised a richer world, we have gotten a poorer world of sorts, to the point that if the trend continues, essentially a coffin will constitute the affordable home. Numbers. Housing affordability. So this is since 1950 the development of an average wage in the Western world. This is, the red line is what the banks are prepared to provide to people as a loan based on their income. So wages have increased, solvability of the banks have increased, but the price of homes have increased way faster, to the point that of course the housing crisis of 2008 was excessively caused by that discrepancy, starting in the United States, foreclosures on a massive scale of suburban homes, derelict, very new suburban developments, not just in the United States but also in Ireland, to the point that there were even entire areas constructed that were not even lived in, so not abandoned, but essentially never lived in. Pristine roads, pristine facades, clean buildings, but not with a human anywhere to be found. England, a similar development in Spain, a development in the north of Morocco. Again, a brand new urban development without a living soul ever having set foot in it. So concrete sculptures, I guess, of sorts. This is the most dramatic example. It's no longer empty, but it stood empty for a very, very long time. This is in Angola, a city built by the Chinese of 1 million homes, the real Corbusier city stretching out ad infinitum until the horizon. Entirely empty, the same surrealist spectacle as the previous slide on a kind of almost unimaginable scale. The phenomena of empty real estate, of the mismatch between supply and demand, is by now a global phenomena, and the real estate market is an interesting phenomena there. When you look at global capital and how it is counterbalanced by fixed assets, by far the largest asset class is real estate. It's bigger than oil, it's bigger than coal, gold, cryptocurrencies, global GDP, you name it. More than on anything else, the economic system is counterpinned by real estate. That means that our profession is at the core of the global economy. That means that the labor we do is the most important labor of all, and we're probably the ones least aware of it. Ever since 1991, Property, real estate, has also undergone a very interesting shift, where real estate markets were primarily national markets until the early 90s. They've become global markets after the early 90s, leaving nations largely powerless also to develop any significant policies to curtail prices. A nationality is by now something you can buy. It is a consumer item, particularly for when you have a lot of money. In 2014, the global risk spent $2 billion in acquiring nationalities. And nationalities, you're not born with one, you acquire one. And what better way to acquire it than through buying property in a country? It's again Hungary. Again, a very interesting example. Hungary was the place where the golden EU passports were handed out on people prepared to invest in real estate. So they welcomed immigrants. Anybody over 250,000 euros invested in real estate was welcomed. At the same time, it's the most xenophobic, anti-immigrant, most racist country in Europe at the moment, at the forefront of this kind of policy. So there we go. Oleg Deripaska, Russian oligarch, is a Cypriot. Rami Makhlouf, a Syrian businessman, is an Austrian. Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal, is a New Zealander. Joseph Safra, Brazilian banker, is a Brit these days. And he is a Brit because he's bought The Gherkin by Norman Foster. In fact, he's bought it twice. I don't know how you do that, and my understanding of economics is limited, but apparently he did. In buying it twice, he raised the price of the building. In 2003, it was constructed for about 330 million pounds, and it's worth nearly $1 billion today. So that's 3 times the original value. And this is interesting. I mean, it's interesting if you relate it to what we do. I mean, I more or less know how the investment costs of a building are built up. So 330 million, probably about 90 million land cost, development cost, financing, management, and then about 140, less than half, is construction cost itself. The architect works on a percentage of the construction cost. That is generally the architect's fee. Now let's assume, I don't have this information, but let's assume Norman Foster is a good negotiator and he got 5%, which is good going, of the construction cost. So therefore, his fee to build the whole building was £7 million. The increase in value of the building after he had done his work was 100 times that, which is a very, very ironic disparity in scale. And once again, it shows that the Piketty logic, income from labor, income from property, also applies to architects and even applies to the most successful and wealthy architects in the world. Which leaves but one question. And that's an old quote from Le Corbusier. Is there a way for architecture to avoid that trap, avoid being on a side that simply helps that trend? Perhaps we ought to think about architecture differently. Perhaps there are compelling reasons to view our profession in radically different terms than we've done so far. This is the well-known diagram of Vitruvius, a first Roman architect to articulate the principles of architecture, the first architecture theorist of sorts, who said the 3 pillars of architecture are durability, use, and beauty. In other words, permanence, functionality, and beauty. And essentially that ethos hasn't really changed. I mean, Alberti, the Renaissance, speaks of eternal buildings. Even somebody like Ruskin seems that buildings have to last multiple generations. And even a contemporary icon like Frank Gehry, in a way, regards timelessness as the quintessential aspect of a building. But you wonder how true is that? How just is that? Because if one looks at the average lifespan of a building, since the beginning of times, it has only decreased. In the Renaissance, the Palais de Tuileries, built for 300 years. 19th century, Les Halles stood there for 150 years. Penn Station in New York, less than 100 years. The Bijlmer, less than 50 years. And essentially our very own dance theater didn't even last for 25 years. And one could imagine that in the near future, buildings will have a negative lifespan. That time overtakes the realization of a building. What does that mean? That presumably means that rather than the construction of a building, you have to plan its demolition. You have to think about a building as something that is temporary, and you have to plan for it to disappear. So that therefore, the three Latin terms would probably have to be replaced by their antonyms. Temporariness, flexibility of use, and a certain amount of discretion, which means that the unwavering ideal of beauty would probably have to be replaced by this. A petrol station converted into a cinema. That means a building that was never meant to last, is preferably used for what it was not intended, and a building that is very, very easy to disappear. So in that sense, what could one think of? Essentially of buildings moving, disappearing, as buildings not of permanent but of highly pervasive stuff, part of a pervasive economic cycle, to the point that if you move buildings anyway, then why distinguish between the vehicle of transport and the object? Maybe the two can be integrated into one. Truck house, floating house, a walking house, and even heralding back to the notion of Ron Heron, another one of the futurist visions from the 1960s, walking cities. Funny as it may sound, I think there might be a side effect to that way of thinking, which could have profound changes on the way buildings play a role in the economy. This is a Dutch term. It's the Dutch word for real estate, vastgoed. Vast means fixed, goed means stuff. I mean, the Germans, that which doesn't move. The French say immobilier, immobilien in German. Buildings are that which doesn't move. Because it doesn't move, it doesn't change, it can accrue value, and it can become part of a speculative cycle. So if we replace vastgoed by losgoed, which is the opposite, it's stuff that moves, it's stuff that's pervasive. Los means lose. Then perhaps it is possible that the cruel gain made from buildings without any apparent reason could be reverted, and that buildings could be part of the regular economic cycle of objects, that there are second-hand buildings which are big, which are generous, which are affordable, which are buyable, and that maybe as the biggest benefit of all, that a particularly horrible class of people living of this could disappear over time. And that is my talk. Thank you.